Welcome to the Modo Energy Power Markets live stream. My name is Peter Barini, Director of Industry at Modo Energy, and I'm joined by...
Hi everyone, my name is Logan Hutz. I'm the CAISO market lead here for Modo Energy.
Great. And we're going to spend the next 30 minutes discussing the state of energy storage in CAISO. We're going to follow that up with a Q&A. So anyone who has questions as we go through the presentation, drop them in and we'll try to get through as many of them as possible. Without further ado, this is what the agenda that we have set for today looks like. We're going to really start by looking at the state of battery energy storage across the CAISO market. So, leading with the headline of 15 gigawatts of operational front-of-the-meter batteries, looking at the way in which deployment has evolved across zones and regions, and taking a peek into what the interconnection queue looks like for both the short and long term. From there, we're going to dive into BESS revenues. So through Q3 2025, we're going to unpack both the merchant side of things as well as the resource adequacy side of things, and also shed some information on how prices have been evolving, how market volatility has changed over the last 5 years. Lastly, we're going to end the section with where do we go from here? It's really going to be focused on two major policy changes that are upcoming or almost in implementation phase within CAISO. And that's really taking a look at slice of day resource adequacy requirements, as well as broader Western energy and balance market integration, primarily through day-ahead markets. So with that said, we'll start with the state of BESS in CAISO. So 15 gigawatts of batteries within the market. So the slide we're really starting off here is just a level setting of what deployment has looked like from an installed capacity perspective across both batteries primarily, but as well as solar. Part of the reason we're leading with solar at the front end is this understanding that the co-benefit between these two resources is really where batteries start to shine. The infamous duck curve that everyone is familiar with, that is born from high renewable penetration markets, particularly those dominated by solar, really is the edge in which batteries are coming in to solve. And so CAISO, especially across North America, is leading in that regard. They have 25 gigs of installed front-of-the-meter utility scale solar, as well as 16-ish gigs behind the meter. And both of those contribute substantially to load, net load, and as well as the bidding behavior that you get in those troughs, primarily supported by renewable energy credits. But as we can see here, while solar had its heyday and is continuing to grow in about the 2010, 2015 timeframe, a lot of that pushed through by renewable portfolio standards. So California in 2002 was already establishing RPS targets for 2017. Those have continued to evolve and grow. And right now where we stand, CAISO is looking at 60% RPS by 2030 and 100% GHG free by 2045. And like I mentioned, that's really important for batteries. While they're not contributing to that from a generation perspective, they're taking advantage of the load shape and the bidding behavior that a lot of these RPS eligible resources are introducing to the CAISO market. Batteries are right on their heel. Since about the 2020s, battery uptake in CAISO has really exploded, primarily from front of the meter. If we take a look at where we are today, going back to that headline figure, there's about 15 gigawatts of operational front-of-the-meter battery resources that result in over 55 gigawatt hours of capacity. Now, CAISO, yes, from an installed capacity standpoint, could be compared to other markets like ERCOT, which they're always kind of competing for most deployed megawatts of capacity, as well as other markets across the world. But what's really unique to the CAISO market is the capacity or the depth of discharge that these storage assets come from. Because of the way the resource adequacy program has been established, CAISO and California's approach to capacity markets, there's really been a push for 4-hour plus duration assets. And so, yes, there's a handful of shorter duration assets, but by and large, most storage assets within CAISO are 4 hours, leading to that, again, very impressive capacity number that we see on this chart. As we look at where batteries have been built to date, I'll take off the new in 2025, but historically most batteries have been located within the SP15 load zone. And again, this goes back to the beginning of the story, right? There's this synergistic relationship with solar. California is a pretty expansive state, north to south, and the delta in solar irradiance, or average capacity factor that you'd see on the solar side, translates to where BESS is getting built as well, right? So not surprisingly, a lot of that BESS and solar has been built in the Southern California region. In addition to that, California is known for having some of the largest battery sites. So, two projects that came online in 2021. One of those was Moss Landing, which at the time was the biggest storage project in the world, only to kind of, I guess, quickly get supplanted by the Edward Sanborn. And I guess one thing to note on this is we're aggregating all of the individual sites under a kind of portfolio BESS project and putting them all here for you to look at. And so those are some of the kind of leading edge, large size batteries. Obviously Moss Landing has had some technical issues recently. I guess the fires have put out a couple of their units and they're still working through that. But for the most part, these are some of the largest battery assets in North America. Since then, that new in 2025, we are seeing an expansion, obviously a doubling down in the southern zone, but an expansion northward as well. And, part of that is to take advantage of market opportunities from, merchant market opportunities, looking at TB spreads, again, which we'll talk about a little later. But the other story along the lines here is really a way to meet ongoing capacity requirements. So again, we'll take further looks at this later, but CAISO has a 3-tiered system, and specifically for those flex and local RA requirements, batteries are starting to be, again, deployed much more widely. What this looks like from a growth perspective, 80% or so of the current installed capacity is in that SP15 zone. And it is something we expect to see continuing going forward, which Logan will talk us through in a couple of slides here.
Yeah, thank you, Pete. So as Pete was saying, there's this sort of complementary relationship between solar panels and battery energy storage systems, which we've seen in the outgrowth of batteries in the southern part of the state, where there's also an increased concentration of solar sites. But there's many ways that you can physically arrange these assets. The two most prominent being hybrid and co-located assets. Of the 15 gigawatts, or roughly 15 gigawatts that are in California's grid today, about 6 gigawatts are paired in some way. 1 gigawatt or so has a hybrid arrangement, and the other 5 gigawatts within the set have a co-located arrangement between the physical sites, or the physical assets on the site. The difference between those two things being hybrid sites are DC coupled assets. They have a shared interconnection point to the grid, whereas co-located sites or co-located assets merely share the same physical site itself and have different interconnection points. If you're familiar with Modo Energy's CAISO BESS index, this difference in physical arrangement is why we're able to include co-located sites, but not able to include hybrid sites. We really don't have the telemetry to be able to tell which asset is doing the discharging when. And so rather than deal with all that physical and accounting problems, we just look at standalone battery revenues and operations and co-located battery operations in our Modo Energy CAISO BESS index. I just mentioned standalone, and that physical arrangement brings up the last of the possible arrangements in CAISO, which is this blue bar that you see on the chart. To date, there's about 8.6 gigawatts of standalone BESS in CAISO, making up about 60% of the current makeup. However, that advantaged position is really only a recent development. As recently as January of 2025, co-located and standalone BESS had a much more even footing, with standalone BESS being about 5.5 gigawatts and co-located BESS being about 4.5. So really it's really only a recent trend we've seen where standalone BESS have really taken a strong position amidst the other physical arrangements. Oh, sorry. And so the trend of battery build out has really only come into force in 2020 or so. But these are large projects that take a long time to get through the interconnection process and to actually get the physical assets assembled. And so we can see that sort of depicted on this chart, where each line is an individual project in CAISO. The leftmost point in that line is whenever the project registered as entering the interconnection queue, and the rightmost point is whenever it exited, i.e. it came online. And the various colors represent the technology types. The bright yellow color indicates solar panels. The purple indicates solar and co-located or hybrid BESS at those sites. And then the vibrant blue color are standalone BESS. And you can see that from about 2010, say, solar panels really came into their own and dominated the interconnection queue. In about 2015, we saw batteries coming online and really being paired or standalone and kind of overtaking the queue in their own way. And most of those came online again, maybe within the last 2.5 years or so. Yes, thank you, Pete. So here we can see most of this. The largest collection of them have really entered the queue in 2015 and later. And because of that surge in interconnection requests, there have been, I would say, maybe prominent delays in the actual implementation of these processes, purely because there's all sorts of iterations that the CAISO has to do in managing the interconnection process and making sure they can fulfill their goals of grid stability. And we can look at the length of these lines on this next chart, where instead of having each of them individually, we just group by project type. And it really does show that solar and BESS, the second to the bottom category, and standalone BESS do have the longest interconnection timelines within CAISO. But again, that's really just because of their late entry into the queue so far. But it does have to be noted that these two interconnection charts, over the timeline that the data covers, there have been a variety of interconnection processes and policies that the CAISO has implemented, the most recent of which is, of course, the cluster study process, which we and the CAISO and FERC obviously all hope will sort of expedite the interconnection process and really get these renewable projects online. And so moving from the recent past and longer term past and shifting our vantage point to the horizon line and looking towards the future, we can take a gander at CAISO's interconnection queues to see what we expect to come online in terms of batteries in the near and far term. In the near term, CAISO has one particular data set that does divvy up by physical arrangement type, be the assets standalone, co-located, or hybrid. These assets have all been assigned resource IDs, so they will come online. It is just a matter of when. Another way of saying that is by about 2028, the last data point on this graph, we do expect to see roughly 24 gigawatts of utility scale BESS online in CAISO. But how we get there, maybe the shape of the line there, could be different depending on when exactly those projects are able to come online. And as I mentioned earlier, the recent supplanting of standalone BESS as the dominant physical arrangement, is really a recent trend, but it is one that we will see continue into the near-term future based off of CAISO's public queue data. So that covers the near-term build-out. You can see that same near-term build-out on this next chart. This middle line is the exact same near-term BESS projects. So these are the ones that will come online. Again, it's just a matter of when. CAISO operates and maintains a secondary queue data set. This is for more speculative projects. And so if we use that and we adjust it in ways that I'll get to in a little bit further and a little bit later, we see by 2035, roughly 44 gigawatts of utility scale BESS coming online. I mentioned that this is adjusted in some way. So if you take CAISO's public facing queue at a face value, you would have roughly 100 gigawatts of grid scale batteries installed by the same point in time. Obviously, that's a little bit unreasonable for a number of reasons. One, these are merely statements of intent. Some developers may offer or may enter multiple projects into the interconnection queue with the intention only to ever interconnect one of them, and so there may be a duplication of gigawatts here and there. So those are some of the reasons why what we expect in reality will not be borne out by that headline 100 gigawatt number. How we adjust it is we apply the exact same process that CAISO does. namely the transmission plan deliverability process. My colleague Diksha has an article from early this year covering this process if you're more interested in the details. But the broad overview is just that CAISO looks at what substation you want to connect your asset to. It looks at the availability that substation can support in terms of transmission, and then it ranks all the assets that want to connect to that substation by how far along they are in the queue, and then we'll allocate the available capacity of that substation to each of those assets in rank order. And so once that substation reaches its capacity threshold, that's when we stop interconnecting batteries at the substation, and that sort of filtering process is what reduces that 100 gigawatt headline number down to the 20 new gigawatts that we see from this long-term queue, all for a total of 44 gigawatts from a fleet-wide perspective by 2035.
And by in effect, by doing that, ultimately what we're filtering out is for sites that are going to experience or expect to experience low grid connection costs. Obviously, grid connection costs can vary pretty widely by region, and can be the determining factor of go or no go on building a site, depending on its overall impact to your capex. So, moving along to the next section now, we're going to take a look at BESS revenues through Q3 of 2025. But before we do that, we're going to really introduce the idea that merchant revenue opportunities, and again, merchant is really ancillary and energy arb for the purposes of batteries and CAISO, but merchant revenue opportunities across the board are declining. And it's not too dissimilar to what we're seeing in other markets, tangentially for those that are pretty far along the path of storage maturity. But one kind of quick and dirty or easy way to measure the volatility potential, the arbitrage potential, is looking at what we call top-bottom spreads, so TB spreads. Ultimately, what a TB spread is doing is looking at the lowest price hour against the highest price hour across a range of durations. So you can see all the way on the left side of your screen, you'll see a TB1, and that's ultimately taking the average of the lowest 15-minute prices against the highest and plotting that delta. We can extend that all the way out in these charts that we've done to TB8. We can go as far as TB, 12s if that would be of interest. But ultimately, these TB spreads give us a really good indication of what merchant revenue opportunities look like across each of the zones. I think the two things that are worth pointing out on this chart are, one, each one of those TB spreads are coming in lower and lower pretty consistently on an annual basis. Part of that is due to the, self-cannibalizing nature of BESS deployment. The other probably elephant in the room there is we've had pretty mild weather across most of North America over the last 12, 24 months. The second thing that's really interesting to point out is, obviously, when we're looking at this, the southern region, so SB15 and to a wider extent ZP26, provide the highest opportunities for energy arb. There is a kind of growing benefit of longer duration assets, and we'll take a look at why that might be on the next slide. So if we take similar data but in a different view, so this is just plotting the average 15-minute energy price across each year. CAISO has really developed, or it's starting to fade, but was really a dual peaking system. So a lot of these power systems that are very reliant on intermittent, in particular solar energy, struggle in the very early hours of the day before the sun rises, and in the late evening hours while the sun is setting. But the thing that I really want to point out from this chart is two things. One, that if you look at the 2022 line, almost setting the peak of pricing in the morning and evening hours in 2022 versus 2025, we're seeing a dampening of about on average $100 per megawatt hour. At the same time, that midday trough continues to decline, right? And that's primarily driven by the deployment of solar. But it's not declining nearly as fast, right? And so you have your peak prices the ratio of decline in peak to off peak is about 2 to 1 that we've observed historically. I think the second interesting thing to pull out of this, well, taking one step back, that's kind of what's hurting the shorter duration, merchant revenue opportunities. The second thing to take away from the slide is really the flattening of both the peaks and the troughs. And that's part of the reason why you're seeing more of that linear relationship between the TB1s, if you would, and the TB8s.
Yeah, another way to frame that, the linearity of the TB curves as you increase the horizons. I guess intuitively you get that linearity because you have the same bottom price that you're subtracting from the TB measure and the same top price that you're adding. So instead of having an evening peak that then declines towards midnight and later, it's really once 6 p.m. hits, the day ahead price is just flat until 6 a.m. hits the next day, and then it declines as solar generation comes online. So you're adding the same top price and subtracting the same bottom price from your TB measure, and that creates that linearity in the TB curve. And what that means is the marginal benefit to adding 1 hour of duration to your assets in CAISO is actually higher than it was previously. In absolute terms, the TB curves are lower, but the marginal benefit of adding an hour is what is higher. And as per kilowatt hour costs of a battery fuel cell continue to decline, all that really is an argument for longer generation storage, which then is a boon to energy storage more generally in California, because then you can contribute more to RA and continuing to help CAISO accomplish its policy goals.
Yep. And then the last slide to round out this kind of market volatility section is looking at what price spreads have been at nodes with and without BESS. So on the left side, you're seeing 2024 year to date. On the right side, you're seeing 2025 year to date. There's two distinct lines that are, aligned with the right axes over there. And that's looking at the delta really between average price on the system versus price at a node that has a battery system assigned to it. And, in 2024, you would get this nice spread between the average LMP and the price that you were observing at your node, because of the continued deployment of storage. And a lot of that is influenced by more and more competitive bids for charging and obviously discharging as well. That price spread has reduced substantially. I think the other thing to highlight here is really just looking at, which is corresponding to the left axis, really what the best net output is. So from a charging perspective, on average year to date in 2024, you were looking at about 2.8 gigs at 12 p.m. That's increased nearly 150%, and now you're closer to about 4 gigs in that same time frame. So again, that almost cannibalizing component of BESS in a predominantly renewable system.
Thank you, Pete. And so in general, we have this compression of arbitrage opportunities. And so it really should be no surprise that merchant revenues are correspondingly low. We can see that depicted here on this chart. This is the cumulative merchant revenues, I should say, for CAISO's BESS fleet. In 2023, by the end of the year, batteries had earned about $80 per kilowatt. 2024, that was down to about 52 or 54, say. And then through this year, through September, we're about $31 per kilowatt. Were that pace to continue, the fleet revenues would land at about $40 per kilowatt, say, by the end of this year. And again, that's largely due to suppression of volatility in the market as a whole, or in the state's, say, weather or load profile as a whole, which you can see depicted by the coincidence of 2024 lines in 2025. They were basically on top of one another through April of this year. It was once summer hit that we did not see this year any sort of volatility events that would have driven up revenues the same way that they did a year ago. I have a couple of examples offhand about that. Last month, I should say, so September of 2025, average load was higher than September 2024 load, but peak load last month was down by 5 gigawatts. It went from 47 last year to 42 this year. That is to say, the right tail of load demand has really fallen off year over year. And so because we're lacking those huge surges in demand, we don't get the corresponding increases of energy prices, and so batteries don't have that same sort of energy arbitrage opportunity that they did a year ago. Another example is that July this year was 9 degrees cooler than July last year. And so without people turning on their AC systems in the state, you're not going to have large evening peaks of demand in the same way this year. Again, for that same sort of volatility of load reasoning. So that's the story about merchant revenues. If anyone's familiar with CAISO, though, you know that merchant revenues are certainly not the whole story. Resource adequacy contracts make up the largest proportion of the fleet's revenues. Resource adequacy is CAISO's way of arranging for capacity procurement. It is bilateral agreements made between LSEs and individual generators. What that means is that there's, instead of a single clearing price, as you would see in, say, the PJM capacity auction that happened a couple of months ago, you get quite a wide spread in capacity prices. And as that pertains to batteries, they are able to earn about $8 to $9 per kilowatt per month from RA contracts with some seasonal variation. RA procurement is based off of a month's peak load plus the
planning reserve margin.
Planning reserve margin. I always forget what it actually stands for. The planning reserve margin of 17% that's added on top of that. So when load peaks in the summer, so too does RA demands, and thus with the increase in demand, you're going to see a corresponding increase in supply or corresponding increase in price, which we see reflected in revenues here. And then we can, this is revenue terms. We can also look at this in relative terms. All this is that same chart, just shown in as a percentage bar. In 2023, RA contracts made up about, say, 40% of BESS revenues, whereas this most recent month that we have data for, which was June of 2025, that's closer to 75% of the revenue stack is attributable to RA contracts. And we talked earlier about the suppression of volatility in markets, which puts a cap on merchant revenues. Merchant revenues have commensurately decreased by about a factor of 1/2 as RA contracts have taken up the rest of the stack. And that decrease across merchant revenues has really been broad-based across day-ahead, real-time, and ancillary service revenue streams.
Yeah, and then I guess two additional things I'll point out. Definitely when we compare the resource adequacy or capacity market in California to those like in PJM, one of the benefits, if you would, of having this bilateral arrangement is the contract terms tend to be much longer in length. So PJM may be only for the next delivery year. A lot of times the RA contracts for solar or storage plus solar, pretty much everything except for thermal, tend to be in 10 plus years in duration. So really giving you a foundational investment case to build debt and equity off of the back of. And I think the second important thing to understand within the CAISO market is because of the way, again, they've constructed resource adequacy, and this is similar to other markets across North America, it comes with must-offer obligations. So it means you have to offer all of that capacity you've sold into the day-ahead market. And that's why the bars as a percentage of the revenue stack here, especially when we're thinking about what an ERCOT looks like, that day-ahead energy continues and will continue to make a substantial portion of that.
And just as a final note on RA contract pricing, so earlier we were looking at dollars in revenue terms. This is just purely the contract price. The dark blue line is what we've used to construct our measurements. That's the FERC EQR data that has bilateral contract level observations. So here we can just compute the simple average of contract prices, and we see that in general they have sort of been on an untrammeled rise year over year, with again seasonality peaking in the summers. Just as, again, as I mentioned, demand peaks, just the PRM peaks, and so you have an increase in demand and a corresponding increase in price. The light blue line is just for reference. That's the CPUC's measurements for the same average contract price variable. And all that is to show is that this FERC, the public FERC EQR data that we have, tracks it pretty closely, and thus we are quite certain of our revenue attributions to resource adequacy contracts for BESS.
Yeah. And I think the two underlying drivers for the continued uptick in capacity prices within the CAISO market are really on load. So, California is different than any other state that's been I guess, influenced heavily by future data center development projects. So even over the last year of the planning cycle within CAISO, the peak load has increased about 15% year over year, again, by 2040, looking at a system that is expected to have a peak of 66, 67 gigawatts versus the 55-ish in the 2023 IPER reports. I think the second aspect there is thermal retirements. So again, a lot of this goes back to California's renewable energy aspirations, GHG-free generation aspirations, but really the heavy-handed retirement of firm capacity. So I'm sure folks are aware. There's a swath of thermal plants that have been set to be retired year after year, keep getting extended for reliability concerns. It's kind of something we're used to seeing in California's history, but the expectation of shortening supply, increased demand, and effectively, lower capacity contributions from intermittent resources is what's all leading to this surge up and to the right.
And here, I just wanted to talk about California's policy goals. Like Pete just mentioned, they do have this 100% GHG-free goal for 2024. And I just wanted to point out here that the combination of solar and storage assets are really doing quite a good job of getting them there. And thus, were we to guess about or prognosticate perhaps about policy goals, I think we ought to expect a continuation or maybe even furtherance of these goals. What we see here is the net load, the so-called duck curve. Some people call it famous, some people call it infamous, but all it is the net load that CAISO sees on an average basis for each year. So each year is the average net load profile. And we see year over year, as the colors darken, we get to more recent years. And 2025's net load curve almost reaches below zero in the middle of the day. This introduces a number of problems for the grid, most notably grid stability at the times of the grid or the net load ramp. So between maybe 3 p.m. and 6 p.m., you can see that on average that increases by, say, 15 gigawatts. And I've seen single hour swings of as much as 20 gigawatts. So this is a highly variable phenomenon that CAISO really has to manage safely for its consumers. And we see that BESS are able to really help manage that, which we can see on this next curve. The dark blue line here is that same net load curve, whereas the light blue dotted line is that net load curve less BESS activity. So we see BESS charging up significantly in the middle of the day, raising, say, the belly of the duck. And then at the same time, they're discharging later in the day, thereby lowering the head of the duck. There are two main effects of this. One, it decreases the actual magnitude of net load changes that CAISO has to manage. And two, it elongates that process over a longer time span, making grid stability a lot easier to attain. And all that is to say, this sort of residual demand curve, net load minus BESS activity, it is decreasing year over year in the same way that net load is. But the area under that curve, which is to say the load that needs to be borne by non-renewable sources, is also decreasing. As recently as 2020, non-renewable assets had to provide 450, 460 gigawatt hours of energy on the typical day in 2020, whereas now in 2025, that same measure is down to about 330 or so. It's about a 1/3 decrease in a non-renewable energy procurement that CAISO has been able to achieve via the combination of solar and BESS assets. I think that's quite a justification that they will continue to do this. They will continue to organize their RA contracts in such a way to continue the build out of both of these generation resources.
Great. And we're just going to wrap up the presentation now with a quick tour of slice of day framework. So for folks that aren't aware, right, the slice of day framework is a new resource adequacy framework that California and CAISO specifically is looking to implement within all the load serving entities that it regulates. Ultimately, what the shift is doing is changing the resource adequacy program from a single peak day or a single peak hour, to the worst day of the month. And what it's doing is also requiring capacity to be shown for each individual hour of that day. So on the left side, you have, I guess a without slice of day presentation. There's 2 dots that you may be able to see in that stacked bar graph, but the bottom one is supposed to represent expected peak demand. The green dot, I believe, is meant there to represent peak demand plus that planning reserve margin of 17%. And in the historical construct of the RA market, LSEs would contract for the worst hour of that month on different rolling forward periods, and you can see there you maybe have gas stacked up against nuclear with some light touches from solar, wind, and batteries as well. What we're shifting to now is with slice of day, which you can see on the right, is it's going towards that, like I said, hourly filing requirement across each individual hour of the day. And so for more traditional resources like your thermal, their process for net qualifying capacity doesn't really change much for most hours of the day. They're going to be pretty consistent. But where the impact does have some teeth is really on solar, wind, and storage. So on the intermittent side, we're changing the way in which solar and wind resources get accredited, going from the traditional effective load carrying capability approach to an impedance approach. And then storage, importantly, in order to qualify for RA, is going to have to show where it's getting that RA from other hours of the day. And so what does that look like, again, graphically? So you could imagine, this is looking at system-wide, but you could drill this down in the, an LSE or a certain balancing authority. Ultimately, if we looked at the installed capacity and the unforced capacity looking against the forecast and the reserve margin, you can see this again, representative picture of CAISO shows that across all hours a day, they're exceeding the planning reserve margin. But what is interesting is that in order for the batteries to show up in those evening hours to provide that RA, that LSE is going to need to show an over-procurement of capacity in early hours of the day. So ultimately, in effect, you're shifting excess reserve margin, which for the most part, I think will be provided by solar and maybe a little gas and thermal during the midday hours, into battery resource adequacy. I think this has 2 main potential impacts from the battery fleet. I think the first one is that, depending on your operational arrangements, if you were able to take a 4-hour battery and cycle it multiple times a day, again, assuming you have the excess capacity in other hours, you could, in theory, take advantage of more than 4 hours of CAISO's, more traditional RA program. And I think the second, and it kind of goes back to the TV evolution that we were looking at as well, is it does start to open up the door on longer duration storage assets, particularly in CAISO. I think, what we would traditionally call long duration will still tend to struggle given the 24-hour time frame that the RA construct is being deployed in. But certainly in the range of 5, 6, 7, it creates a different investment case if you can get RA for more than just those traditionally peak hour periods. And I think the thing we're going to end on here is California, a lot of the traditionally vertically integrated utilities and BAs and WEC, and then you kind of have SPP Markets Plus, are both expanding inward to try to take a larger share of the market. WEEM has existed for several years now already, and WEEM is just the Western Energy Imbalance Market, and that's really a coalition of BAs that have come together to share resources in the real-time market. That market is now, again, under the lead of California and CAISO, going to extend to the day-ahead market. And ultimately, what that will do is open up CAISO to larger imports from renewable and even potentially storage resources. It's one of the ways in which the state is looking to achieve its renewable aspirations without overburdening the cost to consumers. And so as that evolution evolves and maybe the kind of number of participating BAs continues to grow, there's that opportunity for deeper troughs and maybe similar peaks. And so, with that, we've kind of talked with you for the last 40 or so odd minutes here. We're really going to turn this over to the kind of live Q&A. So like I mentioned, if you have one, drop it in and we'll try to get through as many as possible.
Thank you. So you want me to take this one?
Yeah.
So this first question are the main determinants of arbitrage potential the amount of renewables, i.e. non-dispatchable resources, and the weather, i.e. more extremes equals more revenue opportunity? I think short answer, yes. And you're not going to build a business case off of hoping for a plant trip, which would then decrease supply and make sure that your local energy revenue price spikes. But I do think those are going to be the main drivers. You can also probably depend on some electric vehicle build out, or not build out, I should say, but as their presence in the state expands, you're going to see some more maybe dynamic or higher household demand. And so that's going to correspond to people who are at home. That may shift some demand to the evening hours. You can also depend on some of the point that Pete just made about EDAM, pushing midday price troughs lower. So if you're close to one of the interties that CAISO shares with the other BAAs on its border, you might be able to benefit from some day-ahead congestion revenues in the same way that BESS benefit from the day-ahead arbitrage they do currently.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's broadly right. I guess the last thing I would add on to it, again, in power, most things seem like just a derivative of weather. But I think the other underlying factor there is commodity costs. So, I think this is more true in the 2020, end of the 2020s, 2022 timeframe. If high heat or, whatever precipitates larger demand in a more elevated commodity price environment, the hour or the increment in which you get those price spikes is really when you're switching from intermittent to thermal. And whether, in probably most cases, it's a peaker that comes in that late evening hours to supplant or supplement what BESS has been able to discharge. If you get higher gas prices, higher commodity prices, that kind of switch or flipping volatility will increase alongside with that plant's short-run marginal cost.
Thanks. The next question is, how are the market revenues expected to be impacted due to slice of day RA requirements?
Yeah, I think, at a high level, I think the expectation here is that, RA contracts, particularly in the California market, are going to continue to move upward. Again, I think it's important to make the distinction between system, local, and flex. And as Logan had mentioned, you get you get more premium going, the smaller your geographical scope. So your flex and your local tend to get paid the highest. The slice of day is really only attacking the system-wide RA perspective. And so I think for the most part, we do expect it to increase prices of RA in the short term, really as these both, load serving entities, whether the big IOUs or the CCAs, relook at the amount of capacity they've procured, especially excess capacity in the early hours, and the way in which they can manage that through to the BESS systems.
But I believe this was about the merchant or market revenues. Yeah.
I think it's okay. From a merchant perspective, in the near term, probably not honestly much changes given the bidding strategies historically we've seen from battery assets, given the way that the traditional RA market has operated. We still do expect, again, caveating that most batteries are unable to cycle more than once a day, just given their insurance products. that most of that day ahead arbitrage will come within the same time periods across the months.
And to that point, we do see batteries starting to throw their weight around a little bit in the trading markets or in the energy trading markets. In my most recent benchmark report, I looked at some of their bidding behavior, and on a year-over-year basis, like more capacity is being offered for higher prices in the evening peaks. This will not be violating behavior when it comes to like CAISO's market power mitigation things, because it's a fleet-wide thing that's happening at all points across the grid. But to the extent that batteries can become the marginal price or marginal asset in the merit stack, like they are doing what they can to do that and to leverage their position. And perhaps we'll see some continuation of that behavior going on. And then the final question, it got cut off a little bit, but we'll read the whole thing. As merchant revenue opportunities dry up, are you seeing a preference for contracted revenues? If so, what types of structures, i.e. tolls, swaps, revenue puts, are you seeing preference for what types of structures, i.e. tolls, swaps, revenue puts, are you seeing preference for among BESS developers?
Yeah, so this one is certainly a topic that's not, I think, confined just to the California market. When we look at the revenue profiles for some of the leading BESS markets, I think in any down year, 16 months, folks are really going to look for contracted revenues, whether it's to sleep easier at night or to actually ensure you're meeting all your debt repayments on a monthly basis. So I'd say the most common structure that we're seeing get employed in the markets is tolling, with some amount of that capacity reserved for real-time arbitrage. So a lot of times you'll get almost like a toll plus rev share, and that enables both the optimizer and the asset owner to take advantage of real-time price fluctuations and benefit from additional revenue that may come from that. So I'd say toll plus floor, floor plus rev share from a tolling perspective is really what we're seeing pencil a lot of these deals in both CAISO and ERCOT.
Great.
Awesome. So I think that about wraps up the live stream. We really appreciate everyone tuning in for submitting the Q&A. For those that want to learn more, check us out at modoenergy.com. We have a bunch of free resources on our media page, and if you're interested in looking at our Modo Energy Terminal, you can go book a demo straight from there. So thank you, everyone, and you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming.